Jerry was a visionary, and he wanted to drag builders towards this holistic approach towards the building framework. And so, when I talked to Jerry, when I brought him on the podcast, all the subsequent conversations, he never talked about the fact that he was a manufacturer or that he provided individual framing elements. He talked about providing a solution.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales.
Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. So it is with sadness that I recently learned of the death of Mr. Jerry McCaughey, the founder of Entekra. Jerry was 64 years old. An obituary in the Irish Times read, his business motto was, quote, persistence beats resistance, and he applied it with vigor to every venture he was involved in. His passion was infectious, and you couldn't but be excited when you worked on a project with him. He loved business and seeing people succeed. He was always generous with his time and mentored and advised many whom he got to know through his long career. Mr. Jack Murray, Chief Executive of Media HQ and former PR consultant for Century Homes. Century Homes was the multi-generational business of the McCaughey's, Jerry and his father, that was doing 8,000 homes a year, and they sold it to the UK-based building materials giant Kingspan in 2005 for 100 million euro, which was 9+ times EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes. That exit, of course, set the stage for Jerry to launch Entekra in the United States in California. In this episode, you will hear my limited involvement with Jerry really echoes what was written in his obituary. He was thoughtful and he was generous. And to talk more about Jerry and his legacy, I wanted to talk to Mr. Sean Shields of the SBCA, the Structural Building Components Association, where he is the Director of Communications. Sean and I reminisce about Jerry in his role as visionary and evangelist, and we talk about the spectrum of offsite construction and what that means. And Sean very eloquently shares some insights on the legacy, immediate legacy of Entekra, and some things that went well and some things that didn't, but ultimately all of it, I believe, will help our entire building community build more efficiently and better and smarter in the future. So as always, thank you for listening. Mr. Sean Shields, welcome back to the show.
Mr. Bradley Hartman, thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure.
It always is. I do enjoy talking to you. I always learn something from you. We are here for kind of a specific reason. You sent me an email recently just talking about the passing of Jerry McCaughey, and I was unaware of that at the moment when you sent that. And I thought I wanted to get together for a couple of reasons. One is just to talk about your experience with him. I'm going to give my perspective of kind of his generosity and thoughtfulness, largely from afar. But I also think I wrote something a few months ago that you provided feedback on and challenged my thinking. And you and I agreed that we should get together to talk about this more. And thought, hey, I think we can do both. And I think we could do it somewhat elegantly. That's at least what we're trying to do here. So Let me just give you a quick little background. I am drawn to people that are thinking different, that do challenge the status quo. I think Jerry was really gifted when it comes to social media and telling a story that at once is new, but also there's a historical record of success in other places. I'm really drawn to these people, and I had emailed him a few times and he was always very responsive. He was candid. He was funny. And at one point he was going to come on the podcast. And then all of a sudden he got like famous. In some cases, like not just lumber building material, home building famous, like almost like Silicon Valley sort of famous, where other people I would have a guy in venture capital out in Silicon Valley. He's like, do you know this guy named Jerry? I'm like, uh-oh, he's not coming on the pod anymore. He's too famous for me. But from afar, and I talked to him at a few conferences, and like, I really enjoyed being around him. Like, this guy, I want to root for this guy. So that was kind of my experience. And large and small, I'm like, hey, how do people treat the little people when I have nothing really I could add to kind of him? So that's been my experience. And let me ask you, what was your experience working with him, listening to him? Because he went on your podcast like years ago in kind of the pre-famous Jerry, if we will. And you kind of saw the whole ride there coming over from Ireland. So I'd love to kind of hear your perspective.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really is truly a loss with Jerry passing for the entire home building industry. And it certainly wasn't something we saw coming. It was one of those things. He was very personal about that. But, he truly was a visionary in many ways. I mean, he had the advantage of growing up and building a home building industry in Europe, where, they were clearly ahead of us in many different ways because they have to be. And at some point, he brought that vision to the United States, and I think saw some of the dysfunction that exists in the U.S. home building industry, whether it's the regionalization, it's how we go about putting things together, and how fragmented the supply chain is, like all of those things. And I think he saw potential there to try to convert home builders, framers, and the rest of the supply chain to come around this idea of like, at least from the structural framing side of things and the building design, how do we do this more efficiently? And I think that he was great at vocalizing just what he saw wrong here and what he thought could be improved. And then he put his money where his mouth was, and he built a business in California and started churning out structural components and building, integrated building designs, and then putting buildings together in 24 to 48 hours. And he didn't stand pat and like, I'm just going to have my little thing. He wanted the world to know about it. And as you pointed out, like he became a rock star almost overnight by the amount of effort he put into not only social media, but getting on the speaking circuit and talking to anyone who would allow him to listen. I mean, I remember years going to NEHB's IBS show and seeing him up on stage talking about this idea of offsite construction. I certainly was very intrigued by all of that because that's what, my industry, my association's industry does, the Structural Building Components Association. And so, it was one of those like, I like the Kool-Aid that he's asking people to drink. But it was clear that he was going farther than where most of the US industry is at currently, right? And so it sort of creates this spectrum. And I think that then there was always sort of this a little push and pull with Jerry over the years of interacting with him. I always had to smile because he was so passionate about, all builders just need to go all in, just jump into the deep end. And even if you have concrete boots on, you'll figure out how to swim. I'll help you kind of thing. And he was very energetic about that. And I always had to laugh because I'm like, yeah, some builders, they just don't want to jump in the deep end right away.
Right. Some builders cannot swim.
Yeah. And so I think that was always the piece of trying to acknowledge that what Jerry was talking about was where we all want to be eventually. We just aren't there yet. And so I think that's the big challenge for everyone. And, Entekra found that out too, was just there's this progression, maybe a spectrum, that we talked about, that any builder wants to sort of figure out where they're at. And some builders, they're like pre-cut packages. That's about as offsite as I want to get, right? Somebody can go and measure all that stuff and cut it and have it show up and we'll put it together. I feel comfortable with that. Great. Jerry's at the other end of like, no, let me handle everything. And I'll just give you a finished, dried in structure at the end of a couple of days. But there's certainly lots of options in between, right?
Yeah. And there's so many periods or examples in my life where my experience kind of growing up with Pulte Homes started in 2000 in the field and then was there for over a decade. Early 2000s, we were partnering with R&D Thiel. Trusses, we've been doing trusses since long before I had gotten there. Wall panels, floor systems coming out, craned in. Like, this was all I knew. I didn't know there would be people in 2023 that would be thinking, it's interesting, you can do this with floors too, eh? Even though they're flat, they're not vertical, they're flat, you can do this. And that's what we did. And we were marveling at this. Now, as we've grown, what is offsite and what isn't, I think is something that you kind of shared with me from the article that I wrote. Because if a plumber in Chicago is putting together copper pipes, yes, they still do that in Chicago, and they're putting together these little systems to go for each bathroom or whatever, and they build them, they come in, and it's just kind of whatever, this little skeleton, and they just plop it in. Is that offsite construction? Well, of course it is. They're doing some of that work offsite, and they're bringing it in. I still view, the trusses and the walls and the floors, like those are kind of components. In my article that I wrote, kind of just talking, and I didn't hear anyone talking about Entekra, and I believe in this evolution. We're going to look back and say, Katera, it was this different thing, but we learned this. We had Entekra, there was this, right? And there are different things to be learned. And a lot of people like to, I think, group them in the same thing. So I wrote this kind of just poking the bear a little bit. Apparently you were the bear. What I took away, Sean, from when you called me and said, hey man, I got to talk to you, was I read your article, Hartman. I do believe you're wrong and you're a jackass. That was the message that I took away. We don't have to go revisit the whole thing. I'm just joking. I love the fact you were pushing back a little bit and also expanding my thinking. But I think part of it, one of my takeaways was maybe what you're talking about with Jerry, which is what is the vocabulary we use? And if we have Jerry who's inside, and I would view them very much close to the SBCA and components and trusses and all that. And you're like, well, not really. He saw a distinction between kind of what we do and what he was doing. Maybe go into that just a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Bradley. I'm just laughing when I called you. I did it with the greatest respect possible.
Of course.
I think it was one of those things where, again, Jerry was a visionary and he wanted to drag builders towards this holistic approach towards the building framework. And so, when I talked to Jerry, when I brought him on the podcast, all the subsequent conversations, he never talked about the fact that he was a manufacturer or that he provided individual framing elements. He talked about providing a solution, a total building solution to the builder. He was a one-stop shop. So he worked on the building design. He did all the manufacturing to incorporate that design from the peak of the roof down through the foundation. And then he worked on, getting that all assembled in the field. That's certainly, again, on that spectrum, that's way over here. That's one way to go with that. And, I have no objection to that. That's great. And there are certainly other manufacturers who I think of themselves as manufacturers. Some of them think of themselves as LBMs first, but they do all of that. Builders First Source, US LBM, 84 Lumber, those guys do all of the same things Jerry was doing, but they don't think of themselves as like, I will only do the full solution. They back off from that a little bit and they're like, well, I'll give you whatever it is that you want. If you want all of it, we can certainly do all of that. And they've invested billions and billions and billions of dollars just over the last decade to have the capability of doing something like that, right? But they talk about it differently. I think that was the big thing, is they just talk about it differently and maybe a little more quietly than certainly Jerry did. Of like, okay, so roof trusses, sure. You want roof trusses, we can do roof trusses for you. You want pre-cut packages, we can do those for you. But we can also one-up the pre-cut package and we can do the wall panel for you. And if you want 8-foot sections, if you just want the rough openings, so you have everything, square and plumb, great. If you want the whole wall panel package, fine. That can certainly help you put up a building a lot quicker. And yeah, as you pointed out, you can do this with floors too. Yeah, you can have the pre-cut LVLs or you can have the open web floor trusses. And those are already to length and you can lay them out. Or you can go to the floor panel and have somebody in the manufacturing space pre-apply the sheathing, ship them to the field, and then you can just lay them into place. Again, it really is a continuum. And it's up to the builder to decide, what am I comfortable with? Most builders are already doing trusses. If you're already embracing that sort of off-site, like why not embrace more? We're certainly in that space, right, Bradley? You're talking to lots of people who are like, we can't figure out the labor piece.
Correct.
And that's really what a lot of this is about, is like that on-site labor piece is a big suck on productivity right now. So, they just have to figure out where do they want to be on that spectrum and how do they get more engaged in it.
Do you have a sense why Jerry saw a distinction between a solution provider versus a manufacturer? Because if an alien came down and visited Entekra and looked around, they're like, aha, you are manufacturing something, right? So
Yes.
Do you have any sense of why there was that distinction? Was it more than marketing? Was it something more foundational?
That's a very great question, Bradley. I think a big part of it is, I'm going to get a little technical. I'm not an engineer. I just know enough of it to sort of sound like I know more than I do, just to be dangerous. But
Me too. Great.
we talk about the structure. This is one of those things that most people don't talk about because we hang so many things on the structure, right? We put sheet rock on the inside, and we put, all the stuff on the outside, and nobody ever looks at the framework, but everything's hanging off of it and depends on it. Because like if the wind blows and it all falls down, that's not a good thing, right?
That's poor. Yes.
So, that framework is an important thing to make sure that it performs correctly. So we're all talking about flow of loads and, all of these kinds of things. This is why we get engineering into all that kind of stuff. So when you're talking about a building design, you want to make sure that that structure, first and foremost, functions correctly. And from a manufacturer's perspective, also is very efficient, right? So it uses the least amount of material to accomplish whatever task it's being asked to accomplish. And also that flow of loads goes throughout the structure in such a way that like you're removing bearing walls and all the stuff that normally you used to have to throw into the middle of a building to make sure that it stood up. So as you go through that process, you realize, I think very quickly, that there's a lot of efficiencies that can be gained if you control all the pieces. So if you aren't just doing the roof trusses and handing it off, you're not making a bunch of assumptions or having to be super conservative about certain aspects because somebody else is taking care of it and you don't know how they're going to take care of it. So I think what Jerry embraced wholeheartedly, and which I think a lot of the industry is there already, it's just the builder has to ask for it, is that the manufacturer can tend to all of those things and introduce all those efficiencies if they're given the chance to take control of the whole system. And I think that's just what was different with Jerry, is he didn't accept the idea that anybody else would take care of any other part of the structure. He wanted to take care of all of it because he wanted to introduce all those efficiencies all at once.
Yeah. Well, as someone who has fought more battles than I care to remember in purchasing concrete, purchasing framing, purchasing labor, if I had one more person come and say, hey, we got to get the framer out here, got an issue. I'm like, what's the issue? Foundation's not right. I'm like,
yeah.
Should we call the concrete guy? Nah, they're generally angry and they're very busy. So let's call the framer. They're easy. They're always here. And I'm like, this idea of design, build versus segment and hope to God, there's not, our plans are super tight. That's a different conversation altogether.
Yeah. Super tight plans. Where are those?
Good. Let me ask you, there's one thing that really jumped out of my mind that kind of drove my interest to kind of explore. And I think if nothing else, figure out what I think about Entekra, who I'd been following, who I'd been kind of rooting on. And then the 30 million plus investment from LP. Peter Drucker, kind of the management guru, always talks about, or has written about, when there's an unexpected failure or an unexpected success, don't just lump it in with whatever current biases or stories you're hearing. Investigate that. There's something there. And what really jumped out to me is something non-obvious happened when you have a power player like LP. You have all this great buzz. And I think you had, for builders that used them, some really good feedback with Entekra. The fact that just like that, this thing would cease being a thing, to me, I found very unexpected. And maybe I think other people that are closer to it might have said, yeah, we saw the writing on the wall. I didn't. Does anything jump out to you in terms of insights that would say, hey, the insight among many, surely, that with Entekra folding, LP backing out, whatever, there's an insight that came out of this. And this is something that we should all kind of think about and kind of moving forward in whatever realm that might be.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, Bradley, and I certainly can't pretend that I was on the inside knowing what was going on. But I think from the outside, some of the observations I would make is, integration in the building material space is challenging. I think lots of large players have sort of figured that out, either on the good side or the bad side. And so, knowing what you want to do and how you want to do it, and how you want to come to the market and what solution you want to be able to offer, I think it's really important. I think LP probably jumped into that in debate with Entekra, probably without fully understanding what Jerry wanted to do and what he was offering. I think LP probably looked at it as, we know building material distribution really well. We do know manufacturing pretty well.
Sure.
So like, how different can this be? And I think what they found out is it's a totally different thing than what their core business was. So I would imagine that part of this was learning that the hard way over time, that they had drifted out of their lane a little bit on that one. I think another piece too is that, again, Jerry, great visionary, great concept, but again, he was pretty rigid in how he was going to implement that, right? It was all in. The builder had to be all in. Otherwise, like, he wasn't going to work with them. It's hard to find enough builders who are willing to take that big of a leap of faith. As we pointed out, like, some builders can't swim. So they already know themselves and they're like, I am not jumping into the deep end without my floaties. So, that all in piece was a really hard sell too. And I think Jerry found that out over time, probably to his great frustration, I would think, because again, he saw the vision and he was doing it on a daily basis. And he certainly had very happy customers, but he was having a hard time getting sort of the broader building industry to buy into it. And so I think that's why I always mentally go back to the issue was you had this brilliant Irishman come over here with a great vision and people just weren't quite ready for it. I think what's unfortunate is I think in 30 years, and maybe less than that, we will look back at Jerry and be like, he's like I'm trying to remember some of those prefab housing companies that existed, right out of the 40s, right? Where they build the whole building, come up and they'd throw it up in a day with like 60 guys, right? He was sort of like one of those where he's just a little bit before his time. We aren't quite ready to work all the way down to that other end of the spectrum. We'll get there, I think, eventually. A different way to think about it, Bradley, is like from an integration standpoint, we've seen more and more framing contractors as a counterpoint or as something to compare to. Framing contractors get into the building material supply side of things. So R&D Thiel is a perfect example. They were a framing contractor first. And so when they started partnering with builders and they were providing that manufactured offsite solution, they did all of that with the framing in mind, the field labor in mind. And so, all their designs, all their manufacturing, it all fed their framers in the field. And I think most of the successful component manufacturers out there right now who are trying to integrate more and more, they're really doing that with the framing labor in mind and trying to minimize the amount of work the framing labor has to do, because that's really the big bottleneck in the whole thing right now.
Yeah. And that was our experience with R&D Thiel, is when there's lots of good ideas. And then you have to go to the labor and say, hey, just a heads up, we've been more efficient over here with the material. I need to take some hours out of you here to lower your overall comp. You good with that? A lot of people were not good with that. I'm not. No. I am not good at it. And by the way, that's not as good as it is. And all of a sudden, you got a 28-year-old ginger purchasing manager throwing up his hands in the air and saying, I don't know. I don't know what's happening. All these people are smarter than me. R&D Thiel says, we already talked to him. It's good. You can lower the framing labor. You can increase over here. Here's what we're doing. One of the comments that came to mind, and again, I don't know if it's apt, but I think it's what you were talking to, is in Silicon Valley or innovation circles, they talk about being early is the same as being wrong. So on one hand, I kind of think about that. I'm like, yeah, maybe that's it. When, we look back, that'll be a kind of a note there about Jerry. The other thing is I'm reading about halfway through Walter Isaacson's book on Elon Musk. And to read that story and realize how many times Tesla was literally days and hundreds of dollars away from ceasing to be, and Elon Musk was saying, if this fails, it's going to be another 20 years before someone has the stones to try to go all in and do it. And I'm not taking any shortcuts, and we're going all in. So we're drawing those parallels, and you're like, I don't know. What if LP says, you know what? Hey, we're a publicly traded company. We have people who value what we do. We're playing the long game. We're not giving up on this. Who knows what the story could have been? And you just you never know. But that's in a future life, I'd like to see what that alternate reality looks like, where LP not only backs out, but they double down and they give Jerry more money to do it. And by the grace of God, they moved to Texas instead of being in California, why? I mean, why? It's going to be really hard to begin with. Why California? Why would you do that?
I think he tried to move as far away from his family as he possibly could. And California was on the other end of
and like Oregon was a little too cold. So he's like, we'll settle here. We can't go in the Pacific Ocean. Maybe that could be, but well, cool. Well, I appreciate this. And like I said, there's just so many different angles to this. And I think education for me included, you've been helpful with that. Any parting words on anything that we've talked about or any sort of addendum here just before we wrap up?
Well, the one thing that I would add is just, I think Jerry is, again, even though Entekra didn't succeed, I think Jerry did at getting a message out there and being a visionary. And I hope that his approach and his tenacity is instructive to other people who have great ideas and great vision for how to make this building material supply chain and the building industry in the US more efficient, that they take a note from his book and they continue to get on their soapbox and preach from the market square, and they don't be silent, but throw your ideas out there and don't take no for an answer. Because I think, frankly, at the end of the day, that's the only way we're going to move the needle with everyone, is to have more visionaries like him out there pounding the pavement, talking to anybody who will listen about how we can do things better. And frankly, some of it's like, again, doing it offsite, doing it more efficiently.
I love it. That's well said. I think it's a great place to end. Sean, thank you.
Yeah, Bradley, my pleasure. This is always a lot of fun.
All right, friends, I think the best way to close out this episode is twofold. Number one, thank you for listening. I hope it was worth your time and attention. And number two, thank you to Jerry McCaughey. You will be missed.